Charlton Heston as president of the Screen Actors Guild.
Once the quintessential big screen hero, Charlton Heston died last night at his home in Beverly Hills.
My dad, that familiar tone in his voice, the swagger when I watch him on film, so I don't miss him as much.
Hollywood spent decades trying to figure out the truth about Charlton Heston. The cameras never caught it. Millions watched this leading man part the Red Sea and led chariots into battle. Yet almost nobody knew what was really happening behind the cameras once the lights went dark. He built something many believed Hollywood could never sustain until now. Years after his death, his daughter, Heston Rochell, finally confirmed what millions had quietly suspected all along. At 64 years old, she confirmed what many people had believed all along, revealing a side of Charlton Heston's private life that has left fans the boy who became Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston entered the world as John Charles Carter on October 4, 1923, in Illinois, born to a sawmill operator and a mother who later remarried. His early childhood unfolded in the heavily forested countryside of St. Helens, Michigan, where hunting and fishing filled entire days spent largely alone in the woods, building a quiet self-reliance that constantly showed up on screen. That quiet, isolated childhood ended abruptly around age 10, when a divorce reshaped the entire family without warning. A remarriage soon followed, bringing a stepfather named Chester Heston into the family and leading to a full legal name change that combined a family surname with the name of a beloved uncle. The move back to Wilmette, Illinois, left a deeply unhappy adolescent struggling to fit into an unfamiliar high school after years spent almost entirely in rural isolation. Acting became an unexpected outlet during those difficult teenage years, offering a sense of belonging and purpose that nothing else in that new town seemed to provide at the time. A scholarship eventually opened the door to Northwestern University in Chicago, setting the stage for a meeting that would define an entire lifetime, though nobody sitting in that classroom had any idea how significant those following years were about to become for either person involved, let alone how many millions of people would eventually watch that same story unfold across movie screens worldwide. A theater class at Northwestern University introduced a young Charlton Heston to a fellow student named Lydia Clark, and a decision to marry reportedly formed within moments of that very first meeting. That instant certainty was not exactly mutual at first, with Lydia later recalling a first impression of someone arrogant, conceited, and supremely self-confident, though a benefit of the doubt eventually paid off for both people involved. The wedding took place on March 17, 1944, at a small Methodist church in Greensboro, North Carolina, shortly before deployment overseas during the Second World War. 2 years followed as a radio operator and aerial gunner aboard a B-25 bomber stationed in the Aleutian Islands with the 11th Air Force, flying missions far from the glamour that would eventually define an entire career. Following an honorable discharge, both husband and wife pursued acting careers in New York, building a life together on modest paychecks and constant uncertainty about where the next role might come from, including an early Broadway run playing opposite established stars of that era while sharing a cramped apartment far removed from any hint of future stardom. A breakthrough finally arrived through director Cecil B. DeMille, who offered the leading role in The Greatest Show on Earth in 1952, a film that went on to win Best Picture at the Academy Awards. 4 years later, The Ten Commandments cemented an entirely new level of stardom, transforming a working actor into one of the most recognizable faces in the entire world, seemingly overnight. Ben-Hur followed in 1959, eventually earning a Best Actor Academy Award and cementing a reputation as the definitive leading man of large-scale historical epics for an entire generation of moviegoers. Touch of Evil and El Cid soon followed, proving range extended well beyond costume epics into gritty crime drama and sweeping historical romance alike. Stardom of that size, however, came with problems nobody discusses at wedding ceremonies. The secret that kept their marriage alive. Sudden fame introduced an entirely new kind of pressure into a marriage built during leaner years. Actresses and admiring strangers alike routinely pursued attention, drawn toward a leading man whose face now appeared on movie posters across the globe, a level of public adoration few newlyweds could reasonably prepare for in advance. Decades later, daughter Holly Heston Rochell described just how difficult that particular chapter became for Lydia, explaining plainly that dealing with constant attention directed at a famous spouse took a real emotional toll on the entire family. Very few public figures of that stature managed to avoid even a hint of scandal under those circumstances, especially across a career stretching more than 5 decades in an industry built partly on gossip. Interviews from later in life addressed the temptation directly, with a simple explanation offered for staying loyal, that nothing in the world felt worth risking a marriage built on genuine happiness. Biographer accounts from that era back up the claim, noting an almost complete absence of tabloid gossip surrounding the relationship, despite decades spent inside an industry known for exactly that kind of scandal involving nearly every other leading man of the same generation. Even Michael Moore, a filmmaker who later became a fierce public critic over entirely different matters, never once raised questions about personal fidelity throughout an entire public career. Trust built during quieter years before fame apparently mattered more than any temptation that came afterwards. One particular piece of evidence, buried inside a personal journal for decades, shows exactly how far that devotion actually extended long before anyone outside the family ever knew it existed. Filming the 10 Commandments required extended stretches of time on location in Egypt, far away from a pregnant Lydia unable to travel during those final months. Beyond a brief separation during the war years, this marked the very first real stretch of distance the couple had ever experienced since the wedding, arriving right as an already demanding production schedule stretched toward its most grueling final weeks. Rather than simply calling home or sending the occasional letter, an entire illustrated journal was kept throughout the shoot, filled with sketches and written observations meant specifically for Lydia to read upon completion. Every single page existed purely to make someone thousands of miles away feel included in an experience physically out of reach at the time, capturing details of the desert, the crew, and the daily grind of a massive biblical production most audiences never got to see. That journal remained a deeply private, personal object for decades, tucked away long before anyone imagined this story reaching millions of strangers online. Long after Heston's passing, family members eventually shared details from those pages, revealing a side of the actor almost nobody associated with the tough, commanding roles that defined an entire career on screen. Sketching turned out to be a genuine lifelong habit rather than a one-time gesture, with drawings from film sets across decades eventually compiled into a published collection called Charlton Heston Hollywood, 50 Years in Film, offering fans a rare glimpse into an artistic side that never made it onto any movie poster. A small private gesture like that says something 100 red carpet appearances never could. That same quiet conviction showed up in other parts of life too, in places far more public and far more dangerous than any movie set. Civil rights, conviction, and a career built on principle. Years before marching for civil rights became fashionable inside Hollywood circles, a public stand had already been taken personally. In 1961, a picket line formed outside a movie theater refusing integrated seating, joined in protest despite a film starring the very same actor playing inside that building at the time. A genuinely uncomfortable position for any working star to place a career in during that particular decade. 2 years later, an invitation arrived to march alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the historic March on Washington in 1963. Standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during one of the defining moments of an entire movement, son Fraser Clark Heston later described that moment as genuinely risky for a working actor, noting real professional consequences existed for anyone willing to take such a public stand during that particular era, when plenty of studios preferred their biggest stars to stay quiet on anything remotely political. Those actions reflected a period of identifying politically as a Democrat, a position that would eventually shift dramatically as the decades continued forward. Nothing about that early activism matched the image many younger fans would later come to associate with the very same public figure, a disconnect that surprised even close family members looking back on the full arc of an entire public life, especially considering how vocally that same person once denounced racism at a time when doing so carried genuine professional risk. A dramatic political transformation was still years away, but the seeds of controversy were already being planted quietly in the background of an otherwise celebrated career. By 1987, the Democratic Party had been left behind entirely in favor of registering as a Republican, eventually founding a conservative political action committee soon afterwards. Public support for Ronald Reagan followed, along with a growing involvement in conservative causes that surprised many fans who remembered the earlier civil rights activism from decades earlier. Long before any of that political shift, an earlier leadership role had already been held for several years as president of the Screen Actors Guild, giving plenty of practice navigating the intersection between show business and public advocacy, along with valuable experience negotiating on behalf of thousands of working actors during contract disputes. The most defining chapter of that political shift arrived in 1998, with the election to the presidency of the National Rifle Association, a position held for 5 consecutive terms until 2003. Speeches during that era grew increasingly forceful, including a widely quoted 1998 convention address directly criticizing President Bill Clinton over gun policy, a speech that quickly became one of the most replayed moments of that entire NRA tenure. Controversy reached a peak in 2002 when documentary filmmaker Michael Moore conducted a now-famous interview for Bowling for Columbine, questioning the timing of an NRA event held shortly after the Columbine High School shooting. Comments made during that conversation regarding gun violence statistics drew heavy criticism once the film reached theaters, and the interview itself was later criticized by some as an unfair ambush given health circumstances that had not yet been publicly disclosed at the time of filming. Close friend Kirk Douglas, despite holding nearly opposite political views for decades, publicly defended the way that particular interview had been conducted, calling it deeply unfair to a longtime friend. That single interview complicated an entire public legacy in ways still debated by fans and critics alike decades later. Forever tangled up with a health crisis, nobody watching that conversation understood was already quietly underway behind the scenes. The secret life few fans ever knew about. Long before any of the political headlines, an entirely different kind of trust had already been placed in Heston's hands. For 6 consecutive years, the nation's highest level of security clearance permitted narration work on classified military and Department of Energy films, including sensitive material connected directly to nuclear weapons programs. Very few working actors of that generation ever held that level of government trust simultaneously alongside a booming Hollywood career. Recognition piled up steadily across an entire career, including a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1960, the Golden Globe Cecil B. DeMille Award in 1967, the Screen Actors Guild Life Achievement Award in 1971, the Jean Hersholt Humanitarian Academy Award in 1978, and the Kennedy Center Honors in 1997. Later films, including Planet of the Apes and Soylent Green, pushed an already established leading man into science fiction territory, proving range extended well beyond biblical robes and Roman armor into dystopian futures audiences had never seen portrayed with quite that level of gravity before, roles that continue influencing the entire genre decades later. A friendship with Japanese actor Toshiro Mifune, formed around 1960, lasted for decades entirely, through exchanged Christmas cards despite a language barrier and thousands of miles of distance separating two continents. That same capacity for quiet, long-distance loyalty toward friends mirrored almost exactly the same pattern already showing up at home with Lydia. That kind of steady, understated devotion eventually collided headfirst with the single most difficult diagnosis of an entire lifetime. On August 9, 2002, a taped statement revealed symptoms consistent with Alzheimer's disease, a condition that would ultimately define the final chapter of an entire life. The message included a direct, personal goodbye to fans, acknowledging openly that a time might come when such words could no longer be spoken clearly at all, closing with a request that even a familiar story told twice deserved a genuine laugh rather than an awkward silence. A final public appearance followed in July of 2003 when President George W. Bush presented the Presidential Medal of Freedom during a ceremony at the White House.
The United States honors him for his lifetime of achievement as an actor and a citizen.
Retirement from both acting and the NRA presidency came shortly afterwards, closing out a public career that had spanned more than 5 full decades of work across biblical epics, science fiction classics, and countless stage productions performed long before movie stardom ever arrived. By 2005, newspaper reports described a rapid decline, noting that family and friends were shocked by how quickly the illness progressed. Some accounts from that period described difficulty simply getting out of bed, a stark contrast to the commanding physical presence audiences had known for generations across countless movie screens, from parting the Red Sea to commanding chariots through packed arenas. A close friendship with fellow Alzheimer's patient and former President Ronald Reagan added an especially personal layer to that same diagnosis. Two towering public figures from the same political era facing an identical private battle almost simultaneously. Charlton Heston died at home in Beverly Hills on April 5, 2008, at 84 years old, with Lydia close by after 64 years of marriage. Family members later confirmed pneumonia as the underlying cause, closing out a life that had somehow found room for both biblical epics and genuine domestic devotion. More than 250 mourners attended a private memorial service at a small parish church in the Pacific Palisades, including tributes released publicly from President Bush and countless figures across the entertainment industry. Everything the public thought they understood about that private devotion still needed one final confirmation, and it would take 15 more years to actually arrive in a national magazine interview nobody saw coming. What the children finally confirmed: Lydia Clark Heston lived another decade after the passing of Charlton, continuing work as a respected photographer until passing away in 2018 at age 95. Both children stayed relatively private for years afterwards, rarely discussing the parents' marriage in detail through public interviews of any kind. Content instead to let a public legacy speak entirely through old film reels and political headlines. That changed once Holly Heston Rochell and brother Fraser Clark Heston sat down separately with Closer magazine, finally addressing years of quiet public curiosity directly. Holly, born in 1961 and adopted as an infant, grew up to become a respected fine arts expert, eventually marrying Carlton Charles Rochell Jr. in 1990 and raising 2 children named Ridley and Charlie. Fraser, born in 1955, built a career as a film director and producer, occasionally working directly alongside Charlton on projects tied to the family name. Holly confirmed what many fans had long suspected but never heard stated so plainly, describing the genuine hardship Lydia faced due to constant attention from fans and admirers, while confirming that no infidelity or scandal ever actually materialized throughout the entire 64-year marriage. Both parents, according to Holly, took quiet pride in raising 2 children who avoided the kind of public struggles so common among children of major movie stars during that era. Fraser added a separate perspective, recalling a father who believed deeply in quality time and remained patient and present during ordinary family moments most fans never got to witness firsthand, including nightly reading sessions, family movie nights, and long games of Monopoly around the kitchen table. Both children pushed back gently against a public image built entirely around toughness and rigid conviction, describing instead someone capable of real warmth behind closed doors, a version of the man that rarely made it into magazine profiles or campaign speeches. At 64 years old, Holly finally gave fans the direct confirmation so many had quietly hoped was true for decades, that beneath the biblical epics, the political battles, and the commanding screen presence, one loyal, quiet marriage had genuinely lasted until the very end. Even facing a devastating illness in those final years, family members insisted that an entire life had been lived without regret, describing a bucket list with nothing left unchecked and a spirit that stayed remarkably steady until the final days. That single interview did more to reshape public understanding of a complicated legacy than decades of biographies, documentaries, and political retrospectives combined, offering something far simpler than any of those: plain honesty from the two people who actually lived inside that household. From a lonely childhood in the Michigan woods to biblical epics, political battles, and a marriage that quietly outlasted every ounce of Hollywood temptation, the story of Charlton Heston turned out to be more human than the movies ever let on. The children finally confirmed what fans suspected for years. What part of this story surprised you the most? Drop a comment down below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more real stories behind Hollywood legends.